December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest. The temperature drops below freezing. A thick fog blankets the hills, reducing visibility to near zero. In this sector of the front, there is absolute silence. American radars pick up nothing. Allied intelligence reports no activity. For the soldiers of the U.S. 106th Infantry Division, this is supposed to be another quiet day on the Ghost Front, a place where units are sent to rest before Christmas. But at 5:35, the silence ends. Suddenly, the horizon explodes with fire. Over 1,000 German guns open synchronous fire. And while American soldiers try to understand what is happening, an armada emerges from the fog. 400,000 German soldiers, thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, the 5th Panzer Army, the 6th Panzer Army of the SS, all of them launching an offensive in a place the Allies considered impassable. By sunrise, American defensive lines are not just breached, they are annihilated. Entire regiments find themselves surrounded. Communications are cut. The chaos is total. Experienced American units crumble under the blow, abandoning equipment and retreating in panic. And it is in this moment that the Allied High Command faces a terrifying paradox. By all calculations, Germany has already lost the war. Berlin is bombed daily. The Eastern Front is collapsing. The Wehrmacht has a critical shortage of fuel, ammunition, and men. Against them stands the entire industrial might of America and Britain. But here, on the ground, in direct confrontation, something impossible is happening. A broken, exhausted German army is not just resisting. It is winning. It is outplaying fresh American forces tactically, organizationally, and psychologically. U.S. veterans who fought from Normandy to the Rhine later admitted the German soldier was the most difficult adversary of the entire war. It wasn't about fanaticism, and it wasn't about brutality. It was about a frightening professional effectiveness. Man for man, tank for tank, the Germans acted faster, more cohesively, and more lethally. How did they do it? Why did an army standing on the edge of the abyss continue to deliver strikes of such precision? What did their officers know that West Point graduates did not? To answer this question, we must cast aside Hollywood myths and look at the war through the eyes of those who met this strike in the Ardennes snow. We need to dismantle the mechanism of the German war machine and understand why, even while losing the war strategically, they kept winning battles tactically. In the autumn of 1944, American G2 intelligence made a fatal error. The analysts looked at the numbers. They counted tons of steel, barrels of oil, and the number of destroyed factories in the Ruhr. The math spoke clearly. The Wehrmacht is dead. Germany's economy has collapsed. Therefore, resistance must cease. They expected to see the Volkssturm, militias of old men and teenagers armed with rusty rifles. But in the Ardennes, Americans did not face a militia. They faced the elite. To understand the shock of the American soldier, one must look at who the American soldier himself was in late 1944. The average GI was a draftee, a former farmer, mechanic, or schoolteacher. His training lasted from 13 to 16 weeks. It was a crash course: how to shoot, how to march, how to dig a foxhole. The U.S. Army was built on the principle of a General Motors assembly line: standardized men, standardized weapons. If one soldier fell out, the system simply shipped a new one. It was an army of civilians in uniform. The German system worked differently. Even in the 5th year of the war, when resources were depleted, the quality of the human material remained frighteningly high. The backbone of the German army was not the generals, but the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers. These men underwent training for years, not weeks. Even before the war, German doctrine required every soldier to be trained to perform the duties of a commander 2 ranks above his own. A private knew what to do if the sergeant was killed. A sergeant knew how to command the platoon if the lieutenant was killed. In the American Army, the loss of an officer often led to unit paralysis. In the German Army, it merely led to a change of voice on the radio. The machine kept working. Here lies the solution to the infamous tank battle statistics. In popular culture, it is accepted that it took 5 American Shermans to destroy 1 German Tiger. Usually, this is attributed to the thick armor and powerful guns of the Germans. This is only partially true. The real advantage was inside the tank. In the Ardennes, German tanks were operated by crews who had fought together for 3 or 4 years. They understood each other without words. They knew the terrain, ballistics, and ambush tactics at an instinctive level. Against them went American crews, formed a month ago, who had barely had time to learn each other's names. It was a clash of professionals against amateurs. Amateurs who had more bullets, more food, and more trucks. But in the specific moment of combat, in the narrow field of view of a gun sight, experience defeated resources. American command failed to account for the main factor. They were fighting against men for whom war had become the only form of existence. And these men possessed a secret weapon, not the V-2 rocket and not the jet fighter. It was a philosophy of combat command that had no equal in the world. Imagine a scenario, the heat of battle. Communication with command is cut. An artillery shell severs the telephone wire, or the radio fails. The officer is killed by a sniper. What happens next? In 1944, for an American unit, this often meant stupor. Lieutenants and captains of the U.S. Army were trained in a rigid vertical hierarchy. Orders come from above. If there is no order, you hold position and wait. Initiative without permission is punishable. The system worked as long as communications worked. But in the chaos of the Ardennes, communications almost never worked. The German reaction to the same situation was diametrically opposite. And the reason for this was one long word that American analysts could not pronounce: Auftrags tactic. Translated, it means mission tactics, or as it is called today in the U.S. Army, mission command. The essence is simple, yet revolutionary for that time. A German general did not tell his subordinates how to capture a village. He did not write out movement routes for every platoon. He simply set the objective. The village must be ours by 18 shell. Everything else, how to do it, was decided by the commanders on the ground. If a German sergeant saw that a frontal attack was suicide, he did not request permission from headquarters for a flanking maneuver. He simply did it. Moreover, German regulations obligated him to violate the original plan if the situation on the battlefield changed. For the American military mentality of the 40s, this was unthinkable. The U.S. Army was ruled by micromanagement. Generals tried to control the movement of every battalion while staring at maps in warm headquarters. But the map is not the territory. The German system of decentralization allowed the Wehrmacht to react to threats with incredible speed. While an American request for artillery support passed through 3 layers of approval, a German assault group was already changing position, attacking from the flank, and vanishing. This created the illusion that there were more Germans in the forest than there actually were. A single German unit, thanks to freedom of action, could strike, relocate, and strike again so fast that it seemed to the Americans they were being attacked from all sides. A particular horror for the Allies was caused by the so-called Kampfgruppe, battle groups. When a German division was shattered, the survivors did not surrender or run. A tanker without a tank, an infantryman, and an artilleryman without a gun simply united around anyone with the highest rank. It didn't matter if they knew each other. They instantly formed a new combat unit, a Kampfgruppe, and immediately re-entered the fight. Without orders from Berlin, without bureaucracy, simply on reflexes. Americans called this fanaticism, but it was institutional flexibility. The U.S. Army faced an enemy whose processor processed information faster. The American war machine was massive, powerful, but slow. The German machine was rusty, broken, but lightning fast. However, even the most brilliant tactics are useless if you have nothing to kill the enemy with. And here we come to the tools. In the hands of these professionals were weapons whose sound became the soundtrack of nightmares for an entire generation of American men. War has its own soundtrack, and for the American infantrymen in 1944, that soundtrack was a continuous, maddening screech. The standard American Browning M1919 machine gun fired in a rhythm. Chug, 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 chug. It was a slow, methodical knocking, like a heavy jackhammer. 500 rounds per minute. There were pauses between shots. A soldier had a chance, a tiny fraction of a second, to sprint from tree to tree. The German MG-42 sounded different. Americans called it Hitler's buzzsaw. It had no rhythm. It was a continuous sound, like a giant ripping a massive piece of canvas. 200 rounds per minute, 20 bullets per second, 2.5 times faster than its American counterpart. This changed the very geometry of battle. The MG-42 didn't just shoot at the enemy, it created a wall of lead. German infantry tactics were built not around riflemen like the Americans, but around the machine gun. The entire platoon worked so that the gunner could shoot. Some carried belts, others changed red-hot barrels, others covered the flanks. Under MG-42 fire, an American unit was pinned down instantly. To raise one's head meant a guaranteed hit. And while the Americans lay there, pressed into the frozen mud, German mortars began to methodically bracket their positions. In U.S. training camps, recruits were played recordings of the MG-42 firing, so they would get used to the sound and not freeze up. But a recording in a warm classroom and reality in the forest are two different things. The psychological effect was devastating. But if the machine gun caused fear, another German weapon caused superstitious terror. The 8-8, the 88mm flak cannon. Originally created to shoot at airplanes, it became the most terrifying tank killer of World War II. Its shell traveled faster than the speed of sound. For the crew of an American Sherman, this meant a simple but gruesome fact. You will never hear the shot that kills you. First, the tank explodes, turning into a torch, and only then does the sound of the gun arrive. The 88 could destroy targets from a distance of 2 kilometers with surgical precision. American tankers in the Ardennes often didn't even see the enemy. Their machines simply burst into flames one by one, drilled through from the fog. This created an atmosphere of total helplessness. You have the best logistics, you have chocolate in your rations, and jazz on the radio. But your equipment is inferior to the enemy's in key metrics. Your machine guns are slower. Your tanks are cardboard against their guns. However, technology does not fight by itself. Even the most perfect machine gun is useless in the hands of a panicked man. And here we come to the most uncomfortable fact for American history. The weapons were scary, but the men holding them were even scarier. Most German soldiers attacking in the Ardennes had arrived from a place that American draftees could not even imagine in their worst nightmares. Look at a photo of an American soldier in the Ardennes. He is often 19 or 20 years old. He arrived in Europe a couple of weeks ago. He misses home, his mom's cooking, and Saturday dances. For him, 10 degrees below zero in the forest is extreme cold. This is his first real fight. Now, look through binoculars at the man sitting in the trench opposite. By late 1944, many German divisions in the West were reinforced with veterans transferred from the East, from the Eastern Front, or, as they called it, the Ostfront. For the American kid, war was a dangerous job that needed to be finished to go home. For these Germans, war for the last 3 years had been a struggle for survival against a tsunami. They had passed through Stalingrad, through the Korsun Pocket, through endless retreats across the snowy steppe. They fought at temperatures of -40, when oil froze in tank engines and rifle bolts had to be warmed by breath. For an Eastern Front veteran, the forest in the Ardennes did not look scary. Compared to the Russian winter, it was almost comfortable. Compared to the endless waves of Soviet artillery, the American barrage seemed tolerable. Here lay a gigantic psychological gap. When an American unit was surrounded in the Ardennes, panic often set in. We are cut off. There is no help. We must surrender. This is a logical reaction for a normal human being. But when these German veterans were surrounded, they didn't panic. They had been surrounded 5 times before. They knew how to conserve ammo. They knew how to sleep in the snow and not freeze to death. They lacked that layer of civility that Americans still possessed. American reports of the time are peppered with the word fanatics. But often, this wasn't political fanaticism. It was the icy hardness of men who had looked over the edge of the abyss and returned. They fought with the efficiency of the doomed. They knew that if they lost here, the war would come to the doorstep of their own homes. Americans had to face an adversary who possessed a collective immunity to fear. It was a clash between an amateur boxer and a street fighter whose face is covered in scars. But while the Germans squeezed the maximum out of every soldier, the U.S. Army did exactly the opposite. The American system, unintentionally, sabotaged its own troops. We were losing not because the enemy was stronger, but because we treated our people like spare parts. America won the war thanks to its industry. But this same industrial approach nearly destroyed its infantry. In the headquarters of Washington, the Army was treated like a massive machine, and soldiers like replaceable parts. It was called the individual replacement system. The idea sounded logical to an accountant. If a regiment loses 100 men, the Army simply sends 100 new ones. Like spare parts from a warehouse, the division remains at the front constantly. Its numbers are maintained artificially. But in practice, this turned into a human tragedy. A recruit, having passed accelerated training, arrived at the front alone or with a group of strangers. He was unloaded from a truck at night, in the rain, somewhere in the forest. A sergeant, whom he was seeing for the first time in his life, pointed to a hole in the ground and said, "That's your spot." He didn't know the names of the men to his right or left. They didn't know him. Veterans of the unit often didn't even want to get to know the new guys. Why remember the name of a kid if statistics say he'll be gone in 3 days? As a result, the soldier found himself in the most hostile environment on the planet in a complete social vacuum. Studies conducted after the war revealed a shocking fact. The main motivator for a soldier in combat is not patriotism, not hatred of the enemy, and not fear of a court-martial. It is the fear of letting down his friends. Men fight for the small group, for their platoon, for their buddies. The U.S. system systematically destroyed this bond. Units turned into crowds of armed strangers. When chaos began in the Ardennes, these groups crumbled because nothing held them together from the inside. The German approach was different. They fought by divisions. If a division took heavy losses, it was pulled entirely from the front and sent to the rear for reconstitution. There, veterans trained the rookies. They ate, slept, and trained together for weeks before returning to battle. In a German trench, a soldier knew that Hans on the right would cover him because they were neighbors from the same village and had been fighting together for 2 years. In an American trench, the soldier only knew that the guy on the right arrived yesterday and was terrified. General Omar Bradley would later admit that this system was one of the war's major mistakes. We sent loners against teams. By the end of December 1944, the situation seemed critical. The American army was tactically weaker, organizationally disjointed, and caught off guard. Disaster seemed inevitable. But right here, on the edge of the precipice, something happened that the Germans had not calculated. The American soldier stopped acting by the book. He began to adapt. Right under fire, in the snow and mud, a new army began to be born. By Christmas 1944, the shock had passed. Panic was replaced by cold rage. The American army, which looked like a clumsy giant in early December, began to change right on the battlefield. Soldiers and officers realized playing by the old rules means death. They started to improvise. They started to learn from the enemy. The U.S. response to German professionalism was found not in infantry tactics, but in the mathematics of artillery. The Germans prided themselves on their tanks. Americans answered with a concept called TOT, time on target. It was a masterpiece of coordination. Imagine 12 different artillery batteries positioned in different places, at different distances from the target. But the shots are calculated so that all 140 shells arrive at a single point at the exact same second. For German soldiers, this was hell. They didn't have a single second to hear the whistle of the first shell and jump into a trench. The explosion happened instantly and everywhere. The second surprise was even scarier. The secret VT fuse, or proximity fuse. Before this, shells exploded upon impact with the ground. If a soldier sat in a deep foxhole, he was safe. The new American fuse had a tiny radar. It sensed the ground and detonated the shell in the air, 10 meters above the Germans' heads. Shrapnel flew not up, but down. Foxholes ceased to save lives. The Ardennes forest turned into a meat grinder where the trees only amplified the shrapnel effect. This was the moment technology defeated experience. But changes also occurred in the minds of generals. George Patton, commander of the Third Army, did what German staff officers considered impossible. In the midst of a blizzard, he pivoted an entire army, hundreds of thousands of men and machines, 90 degrees in just 48 hours. He struck the Germans in the flank. It was a speed worthy of the Wehrmacht itself. Americans stopped waiting for ideal conditions. They began applying combined arms warfare. Tanks no longer drove without infantry. Infantry didn't march without forward air controllers. Isolated groups of Americans in Bastogne, surrounded on all sides by elite German divisions, refused to surrender. General McAuliffe's famous reply to the surrender demand, "Nuts," became the symbol of this new stubbornness. They held on, not because they were superheroes. They held on because they knew. Behind their backs worked the most powerful supply machine in human history. And while German commanders watched their fuel gauges empty with horror, the American sky darkened with transport planes. Tactics and courage are important, but in a prolonged war, the winner is the one with more trucks. In the final days of December 1944, a surreal scene could be observed in the forests of the Ardennes. Imagine a king tiger, a 70-ton monster, the pinnacle of German engineering. Its frontal armor is impenetrable to any Allied gun. Its crew are experienced aces. But this invincible tank sits abandoned on the side of a narrow road. The engine is silent. The hatches are open. The crew has walked away on foot toward the east. The most formidable machine of the war turned into a pile of useless scrap metal for one banal reason. It ran out of gas. This was the Achilles heel of the entire German offensive. The plan for Operation Watch on the Rhine was built not on strategy, but on a gamble. German generals knew they had fuel for exactly half the way to Antwerp. The rest they planned to capture. Think about this madness. A professional army, famous for its pedantry, launched a major operation hoping it could steal gas from the enemy along the way. When American engineers realized this, they did a simple thing. Retreating, they burned massive fuel depots. They poured thousands of gallons of gasoline into ditches and set them on fire. German tankers breaking into the rear saw not trophies, but walls of fire. Piper's elite panzer group, the spearhead of the German strike, stopped not because they were defeated in battle. They stopped because their tanks went dry. Now look at the other side of the front. While the Wehrmacht counted every leader, the American logistics machine operated at revs that seemed like science fiction to Europeans. It was a war of resources. and America brought an infinite cheat code. The Red Ball Express and its analogs created a continuous stream of trucks from the Normandy coast to the front line. Trucks drove bumper to bumper, 24 hours a day, headlights on. At the height of the Battle of the Bulge, when Germans were rationing shells, American artillery could afford area barrage fire. This means shooting at nothing, just grid squares of forest, just in case. Because there were so many shells, there was nowhere to store them. But the hardest blow to German morale was dealt not by explosives. It was dealt by a standard parcel from home. There is a documented case that perfectly illustrates the finale of this battle. A German squad captures an American Jeep. They search the car looking for valuable intelligence. Instead of maps, they find mail. Among the letters lies a box. Inside is a chocolate cake, fresh, mailed from Boston a week ago. The Wehrmacht officer holding this cake later recalled that it was in that moment he realized Germany had lost. His logic was crushing. We are fueling tanks with potato alcohol. We take boots off the dead because we have nothing to wear. And these people, they have such powerful logistics that they can deliver fresh pastry across the ocean, right to the front line, in the middle of a war. If they can bring a cake, it means they can bring anything. New tanks, new planes, new millions of soldiers. Americans won in the Ardennes not only because they learned to fight. They won because they turned war into an industrial process. The German soldier was an artisan of war, skilled, bespoke, dangerous. The American army was a factory, and the factory always beats the artisan. By January 1945, the bulge was flattened. The German army lost its last reserves. The road to Germany was open. But history doesn't end there. Because when the smoke cleared, the American military did something victors usually don't do. They didn't just celebrate. They started copying the losers. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. But for American military theorists, the work was just beginning. When the guns fell silent, the U.S. Army did something unexpected. Instead of sending captured German generals into oblivion, they sat them down behind typewriters. In the late 40s, the U.S. Army Historical Division hired hundreds of former Wehrmacht officers. Franz Halder, the former chief of staff of the German Army, and dozens of other commanders spent years writing reports for the Pentagon. Americans understood. Their next enemy would be the Soviet Union. And the only people in the world who knew how to fight the Russians on a scale of millions were the Germans. The U.S. defeated Germany by crushing it with resources. But American generals were honest enough with themselves to admit, in the pure art of war, in maneuverability, in speed of decision-making, in small unit tactics, they were inferior to the vanquished. And a process of great transformation began. The true fruit of this learning ripened 30 years later, after the catastrophe of Vietnam. In the 1970s and 80s, trying to reinvent itself, the U.S. Army created a new doctrine, airland battle. If you open the U.S. Army field manuals of that time, like the famous FM 105, you will see the ghosts of the Ardennes there. Americans fully adopted the concept of Auftragstactik. Now it is called Mission Command. Today, this is the foundation of NATO officer training. Lieutenants are taught not to wait for orders, but to act according to the situation, based on the commander's intent. Exactly as German NCOs did in '44. Americans adopted the idea of the Kampfgruppe. Modern American BCTs, Brigade Combat Teams, are self-sufficient modular units capable of fighting autonomously with their own artillery and support. These are direct heirs to those ad hoc battle groups that caused so much trouble in the Ardennes. The irony of history is that the modern U.S. Army became a better version of the Wehrmacht than the Wehrmacht itself. It took German tactical genius, stripped it of insane ideology and criminal orders, and combined it with infinite American logistics and technology. When, in 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, General Norman Schwarzkopf executed his famous left hook, Encircling the Iraqi army in 100 hours, military historians saw in it a classic German Kesselschlacht, a battle of encirclement. It was the ideal maneuver German generals dreamed of, but only Americans could realize. The Battle of the Bulge was a brutal lesson. It showed that a soldier's professionalism is more important than his patriotism. That one competent machine gun post can stop a battalion, and that underestimating the enemy is the fastest path to defeat. Those 19-year-old American kids freezing in the forests of Belgium in December 44 paid a huge price, but their experience forced a giant military machine to change. Germany lost the war. Its army was destroyed, its leaders convicted, but its art of war did not disappear. It was a trophy. The most valuable trophy America took home from the fields of Europe. We often say that history is written by the victors. That is true. But in warfare, there is another rule. Victors learn from those who made them bleed the most.